We're here to launch Kieran's book. Kieran Tapsell was studying for the Catholic priesthood at St Columban's College in Springwood, and then at St Patrick's College at Manly. And Ed, I used to pay you a visit at St Patrick's College in Manly. You had a lovely room overlooking Fairy Bower.
Were you the dope dealer?
Yeah, I was. So, you shared times at St Patrick's at there. Kieran was there from 1962 to 1967. During that time he studied canon law for some 3 years and obtained his Bachelor of Theology degree. After leaving the seminary, he studied law at Sydney University, graduating with second-class honours in 1972. He was admitted as a solicitor and barrister of the Supreme Court in New South Wales in 1973. And he is a partner in the firm of Watkins Tapsell from 1973 to 2004. He's an accredited specialist in commercial litigation and advocacy. He was a district court arbitrator and mediator. He was an acting district court judge from 1996 to 1999 and the author of many articles in legal journals on topics within his area of specialisation. Since his retirement from legal practice in 2004, he's been translating Latin American literature and newspaper columns from Spanish to English. The launcher of today's book is, of course, Father Ed Campion. Ed is a Demetrius Professor, and he just received his higher degree from Sydney University, and we thank him for coming. Ed was born in Sydney in 1933 and educated at a little school down by the river, where I also went in Lane Cove. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts from Sydney University in 1954. He then went on to complete a Master of Arts at the University of Cambridge, as well as theological studies through the Catholic Institute in Sydney. He was ordained a priest in 1961, and he's been curate in many of Sydney's parishes. He was, back in his early days, he also reviewed books at the Bulletin back in the 60s, and was well known for his work while at the Bulletin. Ed goes on for many pages. However, I won't continue with Father Ed because we're not here to talk about Father Ed, but we are here for Ed to introduce Kieran's book. So Ed Campion, please. Thank you very much.
Sorry I was nearly the late Ed Campion, but I got the times wrong. So, let me begin. Fellow readers, this is an extraordinary moment. For the first time, ordinary members of the Church, people like you and me, not canonists, not bishops, but for the first time, ordinary people can learn from Kieran's book what lies behind the cover-up of the clerical pedophilia all over the world. But that's Kieran's story, and I'm not going to steal it from him. We're here to listen to him more than to me. For a long time, it's been a secret, known only to the few, not the rest of us. Now we know. Lord Acton, who Kieran quotes, the historian who Kieran quotes as an epigraph for the book, said, "No secret lasts more than 38 years. Well, the secret Kieran has discovered to the world lasted a lot longer than that, but thanks to him, now we know." Reading the book over the past week or so, I've often been reminded of another saying of Lord Acton's, something he said of a German historian whose work, he said, was scholarship quickened by journalism. And I thought, yes, you can say that about Kieran's work. He's written a big book, it's 351 pages, there are 700 footnotes, 97% of them from the internet, many of those from daily papers, but he's always aware of the real world outside his book. The sad, broken, destroyed lives of the victims of predators that the system protected again and again without a care for the consequences. What was that system? In a word, clericalism. The privileging of the priests that walled them off from the experience of their fellow Christians. The word itself, clericalism, doesn't come into existence till about 1865. It was part of the war of ideas about Italian identity. But the thing itself, the reality of clericalism, was there long before that. Where to begin to tell this story? Well, it's the feast of St. Augustine of Canterbury today, so perhaps I should start with him. He arrived in Kent at the end of the 6th century, 596, 97, as an agent of Pope Gregory the Great's Romanising of the Western Church. And you can see the influence very quickly, because very quickly in the Saxon kingdoms, the law builds clericalism into their legal systems. In court, for instance, in the Saxon kingdoms, a bishop ranked with a king. His word had to be accepted without an oath. The laws of the kingdoms enforced clerical charges such as clerical tithes, burial fees, Peter's pence. All of these are in the laws of the kingdoms. Peter's pence, by which each household paid a penny a year to show their fealty to the See of Peter. The laws gave protection to church property and the clergy. And soon, church courts became the only courts where clergy could be tried for any crime. And some of you will know that it was over that the great battle between Becket and Henry II was fought, ending with the assassination of Becket in 1170, which forced the Pope to extend that privilege of the courts across the Western Church. But it's not all privilege clericalism. There were, I think you might admit, disadvantages. First of all, the clergy had to be physically distinguished from everyone else. They had to have their hair tonsured. They couldn't put hair oil on their hair. And although the friars and the monks wore special costumes, the secular clergy, my crowd, didn't do that, but they were ordered to wear drab clothing and unfashionable shoes. They were ordered to keep out of pubs. They were barred from going to shows put on by actors, jesters, minstrels. They weren't to engage in any sing-songs, and if they were somewhere where lewd songs were sung or dirty jokes, they were not to laugh. And if they were eating in a tavern because they were travelling and there was nowhere else to get some food, then they must be very careful not to get drawn into a drinking school where they might have to shout their round, which in the sapient words of the Fourth Lateran Council could lead to exile of the mind. I'm sure some of you know the Lateran Council. And of course, very obviously, they were not to marry. Nor were they to spill blood. They couldn't be surgeons, they couldn't go to war, they couldn't hunt. Although since we're dealing with law, there's always a way around that, isn't there? When a bishop went to war, he didn't carry a sword in case he, such as for instance Bishop Turpin in the Song of Roland, he didn't carry a sword in case he spilt blood. He carried instead a mace, so he bashed your brains out. That was And as for spilling blood in hunting, I'm reminded of the story of an Archbishop of Canterbury in the early 19th century who was invited to a shooting party at a country home, and he went out and unfortunately he shot a beater and shot him dead. And the penalty for that in canon law was quite severe. Now the problem here is that the Ecclesia Anglicana had reformed itself on many fronts, on liturgy, on Bible, on the lifestyles of the clergy, but they never got round to canon law, and they were still under the medieval canon law, and the penalty for killing a man spilling his blood was, if you were a cleric, was that you couldn't perform any sacramental duties. You were forbidden from sacred rites. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury was in a terrible bind. Why? Well, the normal thing you do there was go to someone superior and get absolved from this. But who was superior to the Archbishop of Canterbury? Well, when the law was written, there was a man called the Pope, but it would have been rather strange in the 19th century for the Archbishop of Canterbury to apply to the Pope for absolution. When the King heard about this, that the Archbishop wasn't doing his work, he said, "Oh, don't be bloody silly, go back to work." There's always a way around. You may think all this is ancient history, but clericalism survived in these ways right down to our own times. Certainly, I knew men who had their hair tonsured. I knew people who didn't go into pubs. Let me tell you a story that when I first went to study overseas, a young priest from the Liverpool diocese said, "How are you finding it here in England after Australia?" I said, "Well, it's a bit different. Of course, I understand you don't go into pubs." "Oh, no, wouldn't go into pubs." I said, "Well, yes, it's a bit like that at home, but of course, if you want to have a drink, you take your collar off." "Good heavens, that'd be worse," he said. However, I wasn't committed to 3 dry years. When a man turned up a few days later who was to become my best friend, and I told him that story, he said simply, "Are you doing anything at the moment? Put on your jacket." He took me down to the Rose and Crown and got me a pint. So Kieran's book is a very important uncovering of one of the secrets of clericalism, and we're going to hear from him now. He had to stop writing it, of course, but the problems go on. We're all aware of the Royal Commission, and we'll be expecting another book from you, Kieran, on that. The Royal Commission is clearly going to need some serious work, scholarship quickened by journalism. Let me just say that on the Royal Commission on Monday the 24th of March, I watched Cardinal Pell being questioned in the Royal Commission, and I woke up at 4:40 the next morning and thought, it's too disgusting the way he threw his men to the wolves to protect himself. I thought of his men, John Davern, John Usher, Michael Casey, and I'm sure those who write about the Royal Commission will be giving that particular ineptitude a lot of coverage. And so we launch Kieran's book. It remains me only to congratulate ATF, particularly Hilary Regan, to congratulate the Veech Library for making this meeting possible, and most of all, to congratulate the author of the book, Kieran Tapsell, the book which I now launch.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you firstly all for coming, and thank you David and Ed for your very kind words. When I was in the seminary back in the late 60s, I realised that the most boring subject that I had ever studied in my whole life was canon law. If anyone had told me back in 1967 that 45 years later I would have returned to the study of canon law, I would have told them they needed their head ready. But when you are looking for something, even a telephone book can be riveting. And 6 years ago, I started looking for something. Quite by accident, I came across a website called Broken Rights. And I saw that it was about the clergy sexual abuse of children. And in my former life, I knew quite a lot of clergy, so I thought I'd better check out to see if I recognised any names. And I recognised all too many of them. The most notorious of them was Father Jim Fletcher from Newcastle, who died in jail, and he was in my class. But I saw another name there which really intrigued me. Not because he'd been sexually abusing children, but because it was alleged that he had been covering it up. He was one of my seminary professors, and he'd become a bishop. And he was a man I admired immensely. In fact, I admired him more than any other member of the faculty. And I thought to myself, why did this good man do that? And Father Frank Brennan recently asked the same thing about Archbishop Little of Melbourne. Then I started discovering that this behaviour of bishops was the same all over the world. You could not explain that by conspiracy theories. You could not explain that by bad apples in the barrel. These men really had to believe that they were doing the right thing. And I suspected it had to have something to do with canon law. So I bought myself something that looks like a telephone book, the new commentary on the Code of Canon Law, and I started working through both it and other papal decrees. Not all canon law is in the Code. There are other papal decrees which are still part of canon law. And I discovered that until 1917, canon law required priests who sexually abused children to be dismissed from the priesthood and then to be handed over to the civil authorities for punishment according to the civil law. In 1904, Pope St. Pius X decided he would put some order into the 10,000 decrees which form canon law, and which, of course, as you can imagine, over 2,000 years, 1,900 years, a lot of them were self-contradictory. A lot of them, like, for example, the decrees against usury, charging interest, were no longer applicable. And some of them were positively embarrassing, like the 50 anti-Semitic papal bulls. So he got together a commission under Cardinal Gaspari, whose assistant or chief executive officer was a young canon lawyer named Eugenio Pacelli, who eventually became Pope Pius XII. And they went through all of these 10,000 decrees, and they threw out the ones which they didn't think were relevant anymore, and they modified others, and they made up new ones. And they threw out the decrees which required priests to be handed over after they'd been stripped. And in the Code of Canon Law, it simply says that priests who do that sort of thing can be dismissed if it's serious enough. There is nothing about handing them over to the civil authorities. Then in 1922, Pope Pius XI, Eugenio Pacelli by this stage had become an archbishop and famously became the papal nuncio to Munich at the time of the Nazi regime. Pius XI issued this decree, Crimen Solicitationis, which in Latin means the crime of soliciting. And it was originally, well, it wasn't originally, right from the very start, its main emphasis was on the crime of soliciting sex in the confessional, which didn't necessarily have anything to do with children. But they tagged onto it the same provisions were to relate to the sexual abuse of children, as well as homosexuality and bestiality. There were no exceptions for reporting this information to the civil authorities, and breach of the secret involved automatic excommunication. Now, people can get excommunicated from the church, but there are various people in various parts of the hierarchy who can lift that excommunication. This excommunication for reporting anything to the police could only be lifted by the Pope personally. Now, after that, 5 more popes confirmed this. Pope John the 23rd has just been canonised, revised it, reaffirmed it, and extended the decree to religious orders, to priests who are members of religious orders. Pope Paul VI issued a decree called Secreta Continere, which changed the secret of the Holy Office to the pontifical secret. The pontifical secret does have one exception. It says, if the accused needs to know about this allegation for his own defence, he can know. One would have thought that might be implied, but canon law leaves nothing to implication. No exception for going to the police. In 2001, Pope John Paul II confirmed it again under some new procedures which had been drawn up by Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Benedict XVI. And in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI reconfirmed it, but not only that, he extended it to cover priests who have sexually abused intellectually disabled adults and those who had child pornography in their possession. This was a permanent silence. It lasted forever, and that's both in Crimen Solicitationis and in Secreta Continere. In 2010, Pope Benedict did allow an exception. He allowed an exception where the civil law required reporting. The Irish bishops wanted to be able to report whenever any allegation, and so did the American bishops. The Vatican refused to agree, but they would allow an exception where there was a civil law requiring reporting. In other words, just enough reporting to avoid bishops going to jail. The problem with this exception is that for the vast majority of sexual abuse cases, there are very few places in the world that have reporting laws. Most countries, but not all, New Zealand and the United Kingdom though, have what they call mandatory reporting for children at risk. But once they're over the age of 18, the only state in New South Wales that requires reporting, in Australia, is the state of New South Wales. None others have it. If you take the numbers from Victoria about the number of complaints down there, 611, not one reported by the church to the police, only 2 of them, of the 300 in Diocese of Melbourne, it's a total of 600 in Victoria. Only 2 of them involved children who are then children. In other words, 99% of all cases of sexual abuse did not have to be reported. So this is the extent of how useful that exception of 2010 is. There are 2 cover-ups. The one I have just mentioned, which continues because the Vatican will not allow unrestricted reporting, and twice now, in January and just last week, the United Nations has criticised the Church for resisting unrestricted reporting. In fact, they have insisted, if they want to be party to the conventions for the protection of the child and the Convention Against Torture, that it should not only be unrestricted reporting, but mandatory reporting of all complaints. The last I read was the Vatican said it would think about it. But there is a second cover-up, and it started after the election of Benedict XVI. It involves trying to hide the role of canon law in the cover-up and the 6 popes who were uniquely responsible for it. You'll have to remember, and even Cardinal Pell has said this, the Church is the last of the absolute monarchies. The Pope can get his napkin out of breakfast and write a decree and say, that's it, put it on the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, and that's the law. He's not affected by any constitution, nothing. He can do it tomorrow. Now, after the election of Pope Benedict XVI, as I said, there was this attempt, and still is going on now, this attempt to hide the role of canon law. The pontifical secret is never mentioned in the 150-page submission made by the Church to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry, nor in the 206-page, supposedly warts and all submission to the current Royal Commission. These submissions follow the example laid down by Pope Benedict XVI in his pastoral letter to the people of Ireland in March 2010. Blame the bishops for the cover-up, apologise to the victims, but do not mention the pontifical secret imposed, maintained and expanded by 6 popes since 1922. And don't mention the role of the popes, and a lot of my book is about this, in rendering canon law useless for dismissing these priests. There are theological reasons for the second cover-up, which I've explained in the book. But the end result is that the Church is still not facing the truth. There are some amusing sides to this, and you'll read many of them in the book. The Vatican's frequent use of mental reservation to mislead, on several occasions Orwellian attempts to rewrite history, and worst of all, turning canon law, the oldest continuing legal system in the Western world, into Humpty Dumpty law. Humpty Dumpty, you might recall, told Alice in Wonderland that words will mean whatever I choose them to mean, neither more nor less. I finish off the book with a reference to what Gabriel Garcia Marquez said about one of the oldest and most brilliant plays ever written, Sophocles' Oedipus the King. It's about a man who had the courage to face up to the mounting evidence of an unpalatable truth. The Church called the submission to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry Facing the Truth, and it's about time it did. The Royal Commission will soon be calling for submissions on reporting to the civil authorities. This book is a challenge to the Australian Church to face its own unpalatable truth and to acknowledge the biggest wart of all in the saga of the cover-up, the pontifical secret imposed by 6 popes through canon law since 1922. Now, I take back everything I said about canon law and telephone books. This is really a fascinating and also very disturbing story. And there are many people I have to thank for their assistance, and I've mentioned them in the acknowledgement. I particularly thank ATF Press, and in particular, my friend Michael Mucci for his evocative, some might say provocative cover. And thank you all for coming.